So tonight, Jim Prochaska will take about half an hour to tell us what he most wants us to know about him. All right, Jim, you're on.
Thank you, Nanny. I'm honored to be speaking this evening and welcome everyone, including friends from across the continent. I'm going to start with my family heritage. My mother's parents were peasants from Poland. Her maiden name was Beatty, which means poor. My mother grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. She graduated #1 in her high school class of 10. She would love to say, if you can be the best of 10, you can be the best of 100. And if you can be the best of 100, you can be the best of 1,000. If you wonder where I inherited my achievement motivation, that may have been part of it. My father's parents were peasants from Bohemia. Bohemia was more free thinkers. My father grew up on a horse ranch in South Dakota. He had to leave home during the Great Depression and Dust Bowl of the 30s. He eventually ended up in Detroit working as an iceman. And the ice ran cometh when he met my mother delivering to the restaurant where she worked. My parents moved to Dearborn, Michigan, in a small neighborhood surrounded by auto factories. My father worked in a Chrysler's, putting on 3 bolts a minute, 180 an hour, 7,200 a week, and 350,000 a year. Numbers count. My mother worked part-time as a waitress and full-time as a wonderful mother. I never felt poor, even though my parents were at risk of going broke when my dad was laid off for long periods. My parents supplemented their incomes by having wonderful gardens and peach trees. They would can their fruit and vegetables for eating during the winter. They were organic gardeners before that term existed. They fertilized the garden by the leftovers from the fish and frogs my dad would catch. From 10 p.m. to 2 a.m., my sister Lois would row the boat. Our dad would use his spotlight to find frogs that we never could see from such a distance, and I learned to catch 2 frogs at the same time. My dad would be generous with our catches, sharing fish and frog legs when our icebox was full. He became an amateur taxidermist that would make 4 frogs playing poker and would sell them as folk art in barbershops. But not all was well with my father. Borrowing from Dickens, he could be the best of fathers when we were frogging or when we went together to spend a month in South Dakota on his friend's ranch rounding up cattle. The stereotype of women being close by sharing feelings and men being sharing experiences. Those were wonderful experiences. But my dad would be at his worst when his demons of manic depression, alcohol, and aggression took over too much of his being. I remember walking by a former neighbor asking friends if Amo was still crazy. I yelled out, "He's not crazy, he's my father." So my title for the religious development part of this is my religious journey over 8 decades. In the first decade, I was a-religious, meaning without religion, but I developed lifelong values like family, friends, fun, and freedom. I grew up in Dearborn, Michigan in a small neighborhood surrounded by auto factories. I was raised as a free-range kid who could wander near and far, to volunteer, for example, to work at age 8 at the circus and rodeos when they came to town. I grew up on comic books rather than real books. I loved playing sports and games, and I still do. That's when I feel free, young, and in a zone. And I love playing with ideas. On the second decade, I became a theist. My oldest sister, Lois, decided that we 4 kids need religion. And off she marched us to the closest church. Littlefield Boulevard Presbyterian Church had a huge influence on my youth. In the early seminars, we served as ushers, seating people, passing the basket, and occasionally giving sermons like this one. At night, we had youth groups that also played church basketball and softball, coached by my dad, which was good given his alienating job. My 2 best friends for 68 years have been Hadley and Happy from our church. In my senior year at Fortson High School, I fell in love making eyes with Janice across the venue. But I wasn't free to ask her out because she was a sophomore and I was a senior. It was a good thing I didn't ask her out because her strict Catholic father wouldn't let her date until she was 16. 3rd decade, I'm becoming a minister. Off I went to Muskingum College in Southern Ohio on a Presbyterian scholarship to become a minister. But it was so conservative, with only out of 2,000 people, students, there were only 30 who supported John F. Kennedy. Somehow I was elected president of my first-year class and convinced other leaders to plan a day of fasting with the money saved going to support Black voter registration in Salem, Alabama. The college gave us a check of $10,000, and we drove down to deliver the donation. I stayed in an older Black couple's 3-room home. They never had a white person in their home, and they feared I was a communist. I feared the shots fired outside the home at midnight. In college, reading Goethe's Faust, I read the words. When I craved to act. So I dropped out of college to hitchhike around the country. To save money for my venture, I worked on a riding stable. On a Saturday night, I took my sister Helen bowling, and who walked in with her Polish friends? Janice, and we fell in love again, making eyes across the bowling alley. What would be the chances that she would walk in just before I was leaving to travel around the country? So I had to hit the road, and I worked alongside migrant workers, picking cherries in Traverse City, picking tomatoes in Bowling Green, Ohio, and gathering cotton in southern Missouri. I spent time in Texas, in Mexico, Hollywood, and Berkeley, staying with friends and learning new cultures. I started my pilgrimage in what Erik Erikson called the identity stage, and I was seeking a deeper sense of myself and my society. But after 6 months, I was convinced I was ready for the next stage of intimacy and hitchhiked back to be with Janice. Partly out of homesickness, and partly because the coach wouldn't let any radical play football, I transferred to Wayne State in the center of Detroit. As a graduate student, I was teaching during the summertime, and the rebellion in Detroit broke out, and I would go down to Detroit teaching my students, but hearing 50-millimeter machine guns going off in the background. And Detroit really died and did not come back until only recently. And I worry about cities in our country today.
That was 68, right?
Yeah. So, as I said, my dad could be the best of fathers and the worst of fathers. The worst of time was when my dad took his own life. Having felt helpless to help my dad, I decided to become a clinical psychologist. I was fortunate to be admitted with full funding to Harvard, NYU, Michigan, Clark University, in Wayne State. I chose Clark in Worcester, Mass, and became depressed. Driving home for Thanksgiving, I was determined to drop out. I asked Janice, if I were a carpenter, would you marry me anyway? And she said, no. So I transferred to Wayne State, and fortunately, we were required to have personal psychotherapy. Despairing in my depression, I said, I should have gone to Harvard. I'm never going to be able to do anything great. All my therapist said was, why not? Decade 5, fast forward. I was a full professor with tenure, a wonderful family, valued teacher and mentor, but depression returned again because my research was having no impact. Outrunning from my depression, I said to myself, I should have gone to Penn State. I'm never going to be able to do anything great. My therapist's inner voice responded, why not? Faced in my failure, I asked, what am I doing wrong? I remember reading a philosopher of science who said, most successful scientists are passionate about their science. I was socialized to believe that scientists had to be objective. I don't think we can be, and I don't believe we need to be. But our science can be objective and needs to be. I asked myself, what am I passionate about? And I reached way back in time to when I was a kid, passionate about personal freedom. And I asked, how free can people be if they are unable to change their addiction or their obsession, to change their depression or their compulsions? Personal freedom requires the science of behavior change. Decade 6, becoming a scientist. Behavior science says the best prediction of future behavior is past behavior. You could not predict my future for my first 7 years of research with 7 publications and 0 grants. The next 4 decades, there were 400 publications with 118,000 citations and 40 grants totaling $80 million generated with my colleagues, our PhD students, and our staff. Let me share some of the fringe benefits that these resources helped to generate. I was invited to Poland by the communist head of the National Institutes of Mental Health. Their treatment of addiction was 3 to 6 months of inpatient service. Compare that to the brief time for services in our country. Janice, myself, my mother, and my father-in-law, we toured Warsaw. And we went to have dinner at the most elegant restaurant in Warsaw. We all had duck and champagne and other fine foods. And the waiter said, if you want to trade American dollars, I can give you 10 Polish dollars for every dollar. And your meal will not be $40 each. It will be about a quarter of that, $10 each. So we took and we toured Warsaw. And another trip, actually what we did was we went down to Krakow and we went to visit the villages where our ancestors lived from Poland. And we had a wonderful time. We drank vodka every 2 hours. One of the kids had a music box, and the women were up dancing. And another woman came along and lifted up the skirt somewhat of a woman from Poland, and she said, communist legs. Then she lifted up my mother's dress a little bit and said, capitalist legs. And we
Skinny.
just, skinny legs, yes. So we had trips to England where that included consulting with Tony Blair, the Prime Minister, at 10 Downing Street. His mother had cancer and he wanted to know how to prevent cancer. And what I talked about was that every department under his ministry should be looking at how their industry or their commerce or other education, how much was that also designed to enhance health and well-being. And a trip to Israel, consulting with mental health services, trying to find out why did so few people go for psychotherapy. Well, it turned out that on the average, people went to the primary care physician 12 times a year, and that really served to be their psychotherapy. So different trips were very, very fulfilling and rewarding. So let's go to decade 7. Some people would say I am privileged as a white male who is financially well off. If that were true, I would be entitled to whatever I wanted, like the rich people bribing their kids into elite universities. But I have been blessed all my life, and I don't know how, and I don't know why. I have been blessed for 60 years with Janice. Our son Jason is a renowned astrophysicist at UC Santa Cruz, and our daughter Jody is a professor of clinical and health psychology at Stanford School of Medicine. Our 5 grandchildren are thriving in academics, in athletics, or dance. I do know that being blessed means I need to give back to my family and my university, this congregation, my community, my country that has been so generous to me. So, my mission has been to take and help as many people that our science can help to become freer, to live longer lives, healthier lives, happier lives, and generous lives. Now, what happens when you have different identities in each decade? What provides continuity to leave you with a whole person? Humboldt, the predecessor to Darwin, and a philosopher and contributor to process theology, said that as an evolutionist, he says that it is natural that we evolve from one stage of life to another. Such changes allow us to experience more in life and to give more back in life. For me, it is the life changes, the lifelong values like family, friends, fun, freedom, and giving back to others. For me, continuity also comes from what some people call the psyche, the soul, the self, or the mind. I love spending time in my mind. When I'm going to my study, I tell Janice I'm going to Plato's cave. I continue to be blessed for my mind to continue generating breakthroughs at age 78. I learned from Janice that I am not retiring, I am repurposing. I am on permanent sabbatical, committed to the purpose of enhancing the health and well-being of as many people as possible. We can go to questions and comments.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation. Thank you for agreeing to do this and opening your heart to us so beautifully. We do have more than 40 people here. And I think what we might try is the chat. A chat button at the bottom of your screen. If you just give me your name, then I'll understand you want time for a question. Okay? So we'll take a few minutes for that. If you have a question, just sign in the chat box with your name and I will call you. Raising your hand may work as well, but not too many people can see that. From Lisa Owen. Okay, Lisa, you have a question? Lisa?
Chat isn't working.
Yes. Not working. Oh.
Which chat isn't? I don't know why.
Huh?
Anyway, I have a question, Nani.
Yes.
I was going to have a question.
Who is this now?
This is Lisa, and I was going to have a question.
Okay, Lisa, let's hear you. Oh, here are lots of questions. Okay.
I'm Jim. I'll be next though, Lonnie. Nani.
Okay. All right, Lisa, go.
My question is, you said your father was manic depressive and that he had later committed suicide. And you also talked about your own depressions. And I want to know, did you think that you had inherited some of your depression from your father?
No, it's a good question, but no, I don't think so. I think it's that I really, well, two things. Certainly the death of my father was depressing, but partly I felt I was going down the wrong direction, that I wasn't going to be able to really fulfill my full potential and to make as much contribution as I wanted to make. And again, it was a good thing because when I went to psychotherapy, part of it was my father. I remember saying that I was just furious and I tore the shirt off my back and I said to get my father off my back and to get free from him. But I think that was from his problems rather than from my DNA.
Thank you.
But sometimes I think Jim gets manicky, and I joke about being his manic depressant. This is more when he was younger and teaching and doing therapy and traveling and lecturing and writing. And
well, it's true. When I was teaching undergraduates abnormal psychology, at the midterm, I asked them to diagnose the professor. And they would give me all kinds of diagnoses. And I shared with them that I felt I was hypomanic, but fortunately it hasn't gotten out of control. Gives me a lot of energy, gives me an active mind, and I actually value it.
And I need to defend myself about telling him that I wouldn't marry him if he became a carpenter. The fact was, he was lousy at fixing anything or hammering anything or building anything. And so the reality is it's because of me he became a psychologist, I joke, and that we have all this great research and knowledge now, because I told him that I wouldn't marry him if he became a carpenter.
Well, when I was in the 5th grade and took the aptitude test, I ended up being in the 2nd percentile of mechanical aptitude. And I didn't progress until about 3 years ago. And now I like to call myself Mr. Fix-It. I'm at the 5th percentile of mechanical aptitude.
But Jim, I just wanted to say that I too have worried that you're a communist.
That you what?
A communist. Well, you know, what my belief is that any person who is not a socialist by time they're 20 has no heart. But then any person who's still a socialist by age 40 has no brain. And I really believe being a capitalist with conscience is one of the ways in which we can frankly do more and give back more.
I heard that joke as a child. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, the joke about if you're not a socialist when you're young, etc., when you don't have a heart. I remember hearing that joke back when I was still in Romania in my teens. Okay, well, good one. Let's see, who else is, I have Mary, who was it, Mary? Well, my list of people disappeared, so I don't know. I do not seem to have a good way of finding people who wanted to ask a question. So feel free, anybody.
I have a question.
Yes,
May I
Yes.
ask a question?
yes, please do ask.
I'm Jean B. Chan.
Yes.
I kind of missed what happened from your either 5th decade to 6th decade or 6th to 7th, that you suddenly became very successful as a professor. I missed that connection. You made a jump.
Yes. Well, it was what I would call a quantum leap. Again, behavior science, it's axiomatic. The best predictor of future behavior is past behavior. You could not predict my future career from my first 7 years. And that's because I was not doing what I was most passionate about. And once I went back and reviewed a philosopher of science, I said, what is my passion? And I went back to my childhood saying, it's personal freedom. And once I began to do work in that area, then my career just took off. And what we did is we discovered a whole new model of behavior change, where behavior change doesn't equal taking action, like quitting smoking, quitting abusing alcohol. It's progress from one stage to the next. And it's much, much more inclusive than the action paradigm that still dominates too much. So for example, typically 80% of the people that we work with are not motivated to take action at the time we were working with them. And we're much more inclusive with people of color, with adolescents, you know. They said, adolescents, forget them, the Surgeon General's report said. They can't make rational, empirical decisions, you know, as if we adults can, you know. But we work with adults. Hi, Lois. We work with adults and with adolescents, and we found we recruited 65% of the adolescents from primary care, and their rate of quitting was just as high as adults.
Talk about how you learned about the stages from the smokers.
Oh, Jan's saying, how did we discover the stages? Well, we did a really crude interviews with 50 people where we had analyzed the systems of psychotherapy, identified what did they say about how people change. We found most systems of psychotherapy, they said mostly why people don't change, because psychopathology, personality, aptitudes, and attitudes. But people told us that at different times they were using different processes of change, like consciousness raising from Freud in the first stage of change, or reinforcement from Skinner in the action stage. And so, you know, almost immediately we knew that that was the missing link, and that allowed us to develop a whole new paradigm of behavior change.
Can I say something?
Yes, please do.
So I'm Jim's big sister in Toronto. We knew he was going to go somewhere early on in his career when he was written up in Newsweek magazine, because he had found ways to help people face the fears of taking tests in school.
Oh.
So in fact, he had begun that the studies that he was leading to later, early on in his career. He may have forgotten it.
I don't forget a thing. That's my sister-in-law. And part of the reason I went to Muskingum College is Lois was there. And I like to tell the story that this new wonderful existential sociologist originally from Japan taught a class, and he was very popular. We both took the class, and we were the only two who got A's in the class. And it turns out that I had to earn my A. Lois married the professor to get her A.
May I say something?
Please.
Yeah, okay. Well, it's not a question, Jim, but it's something that I would just like to thank you for what you've done. I worked in the trenches. I was a clinician and I taught in a medical school, and your model has helped more people than you could possibly even imagine, and it will continue to do that. It is such an extraordinary and yet humble achievement from an extraordinary and yet humble man. And I would want to thank you on behalf of the struggling people who's trusted me to walk with them for a while in their journey, and for the physicians to be who I hope I made an impression upon in giving them some sense of what you taught us.
Oh, thank you. You're Anne, right?
Yes, yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Nice to have
And
you.
Card.
Anne Carden. Yes, she's scheduled actually fairly, I think for September. I'll be in touch with you about it. You're scheduled to be one of our speakers fairly soon, I think. I hate to change the subject. You can always go back to it, but I'd like to ask you to tell us something more about your attraction to our religion and what made you join us.
Well, just to be clear, I am not a member of the congregation. We,
Your friend.
pardon?
Your friend.
Yeah, I'm a friend, a donating friend, is it? But we actually were invited. We went how many years without any religion in
50.
our family? Like 50 years, and we got invited to speak at Star Island, a Unitarian island. And we were warmly welcomed there, and they call it the Isle of Shoals, and they called people who went there Shoalers. So for many years we considered ourselves Shoalers. But then when we were moving to Marin County, Janice decided that she was no longer going to be a introvert, and so she went out and was repurposing with a vengeance. And she took us to the UU. Oh, on Sunday morning, the first Sunday morning circle was called the Contemplation Circle.
Yeah.
And that's the second stage of a model of change. And I said, how could I not go there? And the next Sunday, we would say our joys and sorrows. And I stood up and said, last week, I came to the circle as a stranger, and I left as a member.
Thank you. That's beautiful. Okay.
Jim, I have a question.
Yes.
How did your family of origin react when you took off on your own path? Was there any rejection or curiosity on their part?
Well, remember, they allowed me to be a free-range kid right from the start. My mom also said I had a strong will. I think she meant I was stubborn. But they were concerned that I was hitchhiking around the country. But I would take my suitcase that had Muskingum College on it, and people would pick me up much faster because they thought I was going to Muskingum College. And he said, where is that? I said, well, Southern Ohio. He said, well, you're heading west, young man. I thought of myself as a man with a golden thumb. I never waited for a ride longer than 50 minutes. So, and my dad sent me things and stuff, and he was very, very supportive.
Well, I look forward to more conversations with you when we can just be in a normal situation. I'm interested in what contact, your reference to philosophy of science. Was
Mhm.
there a particular person that influenced you on that?
You know, I read the book when I was at Clark, and I couldn't recover it. But I do believe it is true. You know, the 80-20 kind of formula, that 80% of science is produced by 20% of scientists. And I think 80% of the work at UU Church is done by 20% of the people.
Yeah, we're all in. Well,
I
so,
saw that Bonnie had a question a while ago.
Bonnie,
Yes.
I'm sorry that this chat thing didn't
Okay.
work.
Okay. So, Jim, did learning how to catch two frogs with two hands have any useful outcomes later in life?
Oh, it's great for two-handed backhand and tennis. That's for sure.
All right. Yes.
Yeah. Oh, you know, my sister Lois, she was so good about it. There was only one frog left. Why don't you go get it? Okay. And I said, well, Lois, if you died before me, would you put in your will that I would inherit the frog? And she more generously said, she said, I will send it to you. And it is actually part of our art collection. And I'm going to show it to you in just a minute. Janice said, frog get away?
They're pesky like
Let me
that.
see his sister.
Okay, let me see. Can you see the frog?
Yes.
It must be 70 years old. Must be
Yeah.
70 years old, that frog.
Frog?
Yeah.
Wow.
That thing is enormous.
It's a
It is. I mean, people
bullfrog.
wouldn't believe it. This would be about 14 inches long. And
Let's see
that's
the
kind of
bullfrog.
frogs we catch.
Turn it sideways.
Do they sound like St. Bernards or what?
They have a deep voice. Yeah.
Hey, Jim, what college in Southern Ohio did you go to?
Muskingum College, near halfway between Columbus and Zanesville. It was New Concord. Its claim to fame was that John Glenn went there. And when John Glenn was going up in space, the news would be covering and talking about how he went to Muskingum College. Well, Muskingum College had rules: no smoking on campus, no drinking. Girls who went on dates had to have a magazine between them and the guy.
What kind of?
What they never said was that John Glenn got thrown out for drinking when he was a junior.
The secret.
Jim wants to know what kind of magazine.
Well, many thanks to you. Very, very moving account of what matters to you so much. And I want to thank Kim Holscher and Carol Kerr and Jeanette for helping with publicity for the future. We'll be here Friday, July 24th to hear Sandra Schwartz. And if you're eager to hear a specific person as our speaker in the future, please let Kim or myself know. Thank you very much.